Hello, everyone. Welcome to your next session. My name's Lesley Carhart. It's a pleasure to have you all attending in my incident response seminar. A little bit about myself before we get started. I work for a company called Dragos, and Dragos specializes in industrial cybersecurity products and services. I've been there for about 6 years, and I do kind of a unique job there. I am one of the few people on planet Earth who responds and does cybersecurity incident response when a power plant gets hacked, or water treatment plant, aviation facility, transportation, trains, manufacturing, etc. So that type of OT or ICS cybersecurity incident response. And I've been doing that for about 15 years in a variety of verticals. I was in the United States Air Force. I worked in manufacturing cybersecurity, aviation cybersecurity, and radio cybersecurity. And I do a lot of other things on the outside. You can find me running clinics for cybersecurity careers. I mentor and I run a small conference. But that's enough about me. My job is really, really bizarre. And I need to tell you about it because there is more and more of the stuff that I do popping up in the realms that you all work in all the time. It's very, very important for you to have a high-level understanding of my job so that you can be ready if you ever need to call in somebody like me or you need to hire somebody like me to do incident response in the OT space. My job is really unique in that I'm working in different industrial verticals and processes all the time. I like to tell people my job is kind of like an episode of How Stuff Works. I'm learning how eggs are packaged and what can go wrong with that one week, and the next week, how fertilizer is made and how trains run. So I get my hands in a lot of different integral, critical infrastructure verticals in our world. And I see them on their very worst day ever because I'm doing incident response. So let's start with IT and OT cybersecurity incident response are really, really different things. I know there are pundits out there who say that they aren't. They have their own motivations to do that. But I do this every day and the world is very different. Let me tell you some reasons why. First of all, my number one concern when I'm doing cybersecurity incident response for OT environments or operational technology environments is consequences. You'll hear me use that word a lot in all of my talks. Consequences are key in process environments. We're talking about life and safety, things catching on fire, environmental contamination, things that really matter in the real world physically and can cause real life impact to people's health and well-being. So everything that I do in incident response has to come back to consequences and risk of consequences. It's not just about imaginary money or numbers on a computer system, not about documents being stolen, not about website defacement. It's about, is somebody going to live or die? And what that means is that all my incident response planning and all my recommendations for clients have to come back to that level of assessing risk. What could potentially go wrong and what decisions should we make based upon that? And secondarily, I want to make sure that I never want to cause consequences worse than what the adversary is doing or the piece of malware is doing. Incident response tooling can be invasive. Forensics tools can be invasive. Logging and monitoring tools can be invasive. And they can certainly have an impact on industrial systems and industrial processes. I have to be cognizant and work around that all the time. So my tooling and my techniques in forensics are quite different. All right, next, let's talk about the people. The people who I deal with are also different. I have to have a different set of language for dealing with the operators and engineers that operate these processes and systems. There is a long-term animosity and hostility in a lot of organizations between IT practitioners in cybersecurity and OT people who run the process systems. And that's well-earned. It's well-earned because we've done things wrong for a long time. We've done audits of OT systems and told them to do things in impossible ways. We've asked why they don't upgrade systems that they simply can't upgrade. We've told them to install software on vendor systems where that would void warranties for massive deployments. So of course, there's a lot of mistrust between the two groups because of a lack of translation and a lack of understanding. So I'm dealing with a different crew of people, and I have to speak a different language when I'm working with them. If you are going into this space, you are going to have to do a lot of bridge building. You're going to have to do a lot of, I like to call it donut bribery, sitting at a table, bringing snacks, asking questions, being humble, to rebuild those relationships during incident response, hopefully before incident response. And as I mentioned, we are dealing with a ton of legacy stuff in OT incident response as well, for a reason. OT systems tend to have really long life cycles. That is for consequence reasons and risk reasons. Systems have to be tested holistically so that the process will function without issue. You can't just upgrade one part of a functioning process without a lot of testing to make sure that it's going to contain the proper function and not have issues when you upgrade it. Sometimes vendors require their own testing if they're going to continue to support and warranty a system. And there are very few maintenance outages in a lot of industrial networks. So it can take time to have the time to shut down computers and upgrade them. What that means altogether is we deal with a lot of older stuff in OT cybersecurity and incident response. What that means for me as an incident responder is I'm doing forensics on Windows 95 and Windows NT computers. And I have to have the tooling for that. A lot of modern tools won't run on those systems. We don't have XDR, we don't have EDR in a lot of systems. I can't install agents. And I have to be cognizant of what tools will overtax the resources of those old computers, especially embedded computers. So that's challenging. I carry a soldering iron with me to build connectors for old legacy stuff and a lot of legacy adapters for old computers. And in general, cybersecurity tooling, very, very different. Because of the sensitivity of these industrial systems and the ages and the potential consequences, a lot of what I have to do is very passive. I rely a lot on packet captures. I have to be a very, very good network packet forensic analyst. I have to rely on that much more heavily like we would around the 2010 timeframe as opposed to today when we have wonderful XDR tools. And I love those modern tools and I want to use them when they're available, but in the environments that we work in, it's quite different. We have to adapt. We have to be adaptable all the time in incident response, again, to prevent those consequences from occurring. So older tools, more passive tools. I can't vulnerability scan everything. I have to collect packets and see what systems are talking and what versions they're running of software. I have to be much more judicious in my approach to forensics and to collecting evidence and logs. And there's also this reliance on vendors in these networks. If you think back to the stories of buying like IBM computers in the 1980s, that's still what it's like to buy large industrial process deployments. You're buying a package deal from a vendor with warranties and personnel. You're buying things that fit together across the levels of OT technologies, what we call the Purdue model. So all this stuff is built to fit together and you buy it from a vendor. That means the vendor is very tied into your operations throughout the life cycle of your systems. They might send out technicians to do repairs. They might need a separate connection into your environment that you're not necessarily privy to. So outside of your own VPN connectivity, your own remote access, your vendor might have a passageway to get data or telemetry or even remote access to your systems. And that has a huge implication in cybersecurity and in cybersecurity incidents. So this reliance on vendors means that we have to think carefully about what vendors are in play, how they do things, what they own, and how they can potentially impact the cybersecurity of systems. Next, there's IR logistics. These sites, they are all kinds of different industrial verticals. Some of them are very remote. Some of them are in very isolated places, and some of them have very major safety concerns, right? So I have to be cognizant of what personal protective equipment I need to have. I might need specialized safety training to access things like oil rigs. There's a lot of thought that goes into my personal safety and the safety of my equipment and the safety of the people around me that go into accessing some of these industrial systems to do incident response. And getting to them can be a challenge too. When we're talking about remote access, there's a lot of low bandwidth cellular satellite connections still. And some of the facilities that we have to go to are in very isolated and difficult to reach locations. And we have to plan for that, prepare for that as we're thinking about doing incident response in the future. It might not be just flying to the next airport over. It might be a 6-hour drive to get to a remote power facility or a manufacturing facility. We have to be cognizant of that and think about it in advance, or it's a massive delay during incident response. Next, we have to think about the low-level systems. So those are the lower level things in the Purdue model. So like PLCs, RTUs, industrial computer, ruggedized computers that sit somewhere below standard Windows devices that might be functioning as engineering workstations or historians or HMIs. Those lower level systems, doing incident response on them is vastly different. I'm dealing with industrial protocols. I have to build custom connectors. I might have to deal with custom firmware. I have to know what vendors use what types of operating systems and firmware to be able to pull logs and forensic data off those devices. And that's a vast space. That's a huge realm. If you're thinking about doing that in your environment, you need to be very cognizant of your asset inventory and what vendors you're dealing with and what age of equipment. And then you have to start to do research into those individual systems. The space is vast. There are many eras of technology out there, and there's many vendors across many verticals. And finally, there's some network-based stuff. These devices produce interesting forensic data, lots of it. Industrial process data like historian data, logic from low-level devices can tell us a lot about intrusions and what an adversary has potentially done. So we can't ignore that during incident response. We have to be able to process that data and timeline it and use it as part of a reporting and our understanding of adversary activity or malware activity. So in this space, you have to have people who are cognizant of those low-level technologies, their protocols, the way that they communicate with one another, the way that they communicate up, and what's on them, what's potentially usable from a forensic standpoint. Again, that's going to vary vastly by vertical and technology and vendor. So all of that makes OT incident response really different from IT incident response in a lot of critical ways. But the next question you're asking is, what's actually happening? You're probably thinking about your own environments. What types of incidents might I face? I will break the incidents that I handle on a weekly, monthly basis into 3 general categories. The first category is commodity stuff. Commodity stuff, I'm talking about mostly financially motivated stuff like ransomware, crimeware, etc. Yes, that's impactful in industrial environments. There's lots of off-the-shelf Windows and Linux-based systems in industrial environments today. It's cheaper. It makes sense. We have that IT-OT convergence. We see a lot more IT technologies in OT environments today. And that's for a reason, because that's easy to swap out, easy to replace, easy to configure, easy to engineer. But that makes our OT environments more vulnerable to this stuff, especially at the higher levels of the Purdue model. So the stuff that's more human-facing, a lot of those are Windows computers. And while being infected with ransomware won't necessarily do anything to the low-level process, the PLCs, the RTUs, etc., the problem is you can have a loss of visibility to what the process is actually doing, and if it's doing it safely when those computers are brought out of operation. So you might reach a situation, which often happens, where a facility has to shut down their process because they can no longer be sure it's functioning safely because nobody can see what's going on. So yes, ransomware, crimeware, they're very impactful in industrial environments too. And unfortunately, we've seen adversaries target them more because they've seen that they're typically more vulnerable and they're typically very critical things where people are potentially apt to pay out a ransom. So they're being targeted more and more. The second category of stuff that I respond to is insider threats. So yes, these are unintentional and intentional insiders. Let's talk about those 2 categories. So the first one is intentional insiders. Nobody knows how to break an industrial process better than the people who work on it. And unfortunately, some of the most prolific cases and well-reported cases in industrial cybersecurity history have been caused by people who work in the facility not being happy and doing something malicious to the facility. So somebody getting laid off, somebody not getting a promotion, et cetera, otherwise being disgruntled or paid off, bribed, et cetera. That does happen. And those are difficult cases because those people have access and they know how to do a lot of damage. Most people are trustworthy, but there's always that potential, that small decimal of people who are not and are willing to do something malicious. So we have to think about that. Unintentional insiders, though, I see a lot of that too. People are on 3rd shift in a remote facility and they want to watch Netflix. They want to show their pictures of their kids to their coworkers. So they connect something up. They bridge a computer to another network. They connect to wireless when they shouldn't. They plug in a USB drive when they shouldn't. And something nefarious happens to the network. Not their intention, just a normal human thing that we have to prepare for and plan for in our environments. And finally, yes, there are advanced adversaries that are targeting in industrial environments. I see that all the time too. Most of what they're doing, pre-positioning for future attacks. They're thinking about what they might potentially want to do geopolitically in the future, in the case of war or political struggles, negotiations, etc. They want the capability to impact our most critical infrastructure. And that might be localized or in a wide geographic location. It might be manufacturing. There's really nothing that's out of the box there. There's nobody who's immune from this. Either there's smaller businesses that are being used as a test bed for attacks that might be used against a larger institution, or larger institutions where people have a lot of interest about potentially launching attacks in the future, and they're willing to dedicate a lot of resources to being prepared to do that. It's really happening. I know it doesn't build security budgets because it's not something that's very visible. What we see in those cases is reconnaissance, getting onto a network, finding out what's there, stealing credentials, and also foothold building, establishing command and control, stealing credentials, stealing multi-factor authentication methods, and being prepared quietly to do something in a year or 5 years or 10 years, whenever they need to do it. And not all the cases that I respond to are really a cyber attack. That's another interesting part of doing incident response in this space. A lot of the cases I respond to end up being maintenance issues or human error, the things that normally cause physical kinetic impacts in industrial environments, and they always have. The important thing in the environments I'm responding to is that they consider that there might be a cyber cause, and they're bringing in a multitude of troubleshooting parties to try to figure out the root cause. So they're not immediately eliminating cyber. They're looking at it from multiple viewpoints. They're looking at potential maintenance issues. They're looking at potential vendor issues, and they're also considering potential cyber attack. And they're having multiple teams look at those different potential causes of the incident, whatever that is, and eliminating them as they go. So yes, I have to be adaptable there. This is challenging for a lot of incident responders. A lot of people want to jump to the conclusion that everything is a cyber attack or everything is a piece of malware. Weird stuff happen in industrial environments. They just do. Weird things happen all the time. One of the weirdest cases I ever worked was a power plant that got turned on by itself. And the reason why that happened was not a cyber attack, but rather the touchscreen on the computer having a moth land on it repeatedly and hit the right buttons. And I still had to do forensics to identify the cause of that. So we have to be creative, we have to understand the process, and we have to think about a multitude of causes for the things that we're seeing. We have to be realistic, but we also have to understand that there are potential cyber causes for the things we're seeing and eliminate those in a scientific way. Now, in terms of the real attacks that I'm getting into, I know that you want to know what you can do to protect yourselves. I know that you want to eliminate the possibility of having incidents like that in your environments. Look, everybody can have a cybersecurity incident happen to them in their OT environment. There is nobody who's immune. There's nobody who's too big, too small, too famous, too unknown to be attacked for a multitude of reasons that I've talked about. There's multitudes of types of attacks in different verticals as well. But in general, I see a lot of the same stuff over and over again in the incidents I respond to. First of all, hackers are lazy. We're all lazy. Human beings are lazy. Adversaries take the path of least resistance. And it really disappoints our penetration testers sometimes because I talk about the incidents, the cases that I work on, and they're like, really? They did that again? But yeah, it's a money game. Most of this is geopolitically motivated or financially motivated. And even in geopolitics, organizations like government intelligence agencies want to spend the least money possible too. So they're going to use the path of least resistance to get into OT environments and cause damage, build footholds, etc. So the stuff I see over and over and over again, credential stealing. We absolutely see lots of credential reuse between enterprise environments and OT environments. And when those credentials make it out to the dark web, make it out to the black market, etc., there's always a potential that somebody's going to try them to see if they can get into the OT environment. So credential reuse, weak credentials, default credentials are a big problem. And that's also a big problem because OT environments tend to lag behind IT environments in terms of multi-factor implementation. And you might not know that. The problem is A lot of people are much less aware of what's going on in the cybersecurity of their OT environments because they've been avoiding it so long, and they make assumptions. They're like, hey, we have multi-factor everywhere. But no, there's no multi-factor on the vendor VPN that was set up into that environment by the vendor that's required to do maintenance on the industrial equipment. Or maybe it's taken longer to implement multi-factor in general. Maybe it's not comprehensive. Maybe not all the supplier accounts have had multi-factor turned on. So you really need to do a good assessment to find out where you really are in terms of those basic security controls. Service accounts, I see that all the time that don't have multi-factor on them, that have been used with the same password for a long time, and eventually they get stolen and somebody can VPN into the industrial environment. And then the other one, of course, we've seen a lot of recently is unpatched perimeter devices. So VPN concentrators, et cetera. There's been a lot of major published vulnerabilities for perimeter type devices recently. They've had exploits developed for them within a few days, and they've been widely publicly used. Again, path of least resistance. You might not even be the organization that's being targeted, but if somebody can get into your environment, why not? They're going to use it to commit crimes. They are going to do that because it was easy to get in. So we see a lot of that as well. And those environments tend to get patched more slowly than enterprise deployments because there's less staff, less security awareness, less funding for security. Vendor and supply chain, there are a lot of alternate communication paths into industrial environments. So we have a multitude of ways to get into the environments other than potentially your normal enterprise connections. There are multiple suppliers and vendors that sit in your industrial environment that do really critical things. And a lot of them today have cloud access or receive updates from the internet or have remote access into your environment. You really need to be cognizant of what those methods are, even if you don't personally control them. We see a lot of supply chain compromises, even physical supply chain compromises when technicians come on site with a laptop that cause an incident in industrial environments. So sneakernet is an issue too. We see technicians coming in, we see them plugging in modems, we see them plugging in laptops that don't normally fit your security policies. And those are people who are doing crucial things. You just can't tell them to not show up. You have to allow them to come into your environment. But they're bringing in potential connection into your OT environment that can cause a big risk. And finally, weak segmentation between the enterprise network and the OT network. We like to see a DMZ at least. Air gapping is a lie. We never see air gapping outside of very, very specific verticals. But we like to see some kind of DMZ between the corporate enterprise environment and the industrial environment. But often in some cases, we see that being a very, very weak DMZ with a lot of pass-through for a lot of protocols, a lot of IP addresses, firewall rules that just get added to with exceptions. And at some point, it becomes an ineffective security tool. There's no longer enough of a control in that DMZ to prevent connectivity from enterprise. Say there's a compromise into the enterprise environment, into the OT environment. So you really need to be cognizant of how strong your DMZ really is, how many protocols are being passed through, what impact that potentially has. That can cause a really big security risk to your OT environment. That's my quick summary there of the most common methods I see adversaries using to get into these OT environments and do damage of all the different types that I mentioned. These are basic things. I understand that, but they're not basic to solve necessarily. OT is behind the curve in cybersecurity. We all know that for a lot of reasons. Again, those long life cycles, vendor reliance, the structure of the environments and the process dependencies, and then those potential consequences that come from doing updates, from taking the system down. Consequences are king, again, in OT. So our cybersecurity measures in OT by default are less mature than the ones that we have in our enterprise environments. Here's some basic things that are not so easy necessarily, but the simplest things you could potentially do to make a difference in your OT cybersecurity. Don't make assumptions about where you are. Do a really good assessment, hopefully passive. Remember, you can't go out and vulnerability scan everything. And understand the state of your OT environment. Understand what's going on right now, what's patched, what's not patched, where the connectivity into your environment exists, where vendors have access, where things are coming in that are outside your control, whether that's USBs, laptops, cellular connections, people even. And make sure that your controls, even backups in those environments, actually work. You're probably making a lot of assumptions right now because things function well in your enterprise environment. Make sure they work across the plethora of systems in your OT environments as well. Validate monitoring and logging as well. That's challenging in OT too, because we don't necessarily have those big agent or XDR or EDR deployments. If you're relying on your SIM, if you're relying on your next generation tools, you're probably missing a lot of your OT environment. Make sure you're cognizant of what sources of data you have in that environment and what you can see with them and what you can't see. That's crucial to build a better monitoring program. Finally, OT is different. OT cybersecurity, process cybersecurity, ICS cybersecurity is a different thing than enterprise cybersecurity for all the reasons I just mentioned. If you want to reduce the risk of incidents and the impact of cybersecurity incidents in your OT environment, you have to think about them somewhat separately. I don't care if you have one incident response plan or you have one incident response plan for enterprise and one for OT. Either way, you have to call out OT concerns across the incident response lifecycle and the cybersecurity lifecycle as discrete in OT, because all of the people, the processes, the technologies, they're all going to be different in OT. I promise this is really true. You've got to think about those separately. So every section of your incident response plan and your cybersecurity plan in general, you should be thinking about how does this apply to enterprise and how does this apply to OT? Where are the people, the processes, the technologies different? And where do I need to call that out so if there is an incident, I can handle those two as separate objects as they are, even if they're tied into each other in an integral way. Finally, I want to leave you with the 5 critical controls for ICS. There is a wonderful SANS white paper by this name. It was written by Rob Lee and Tim Conway. You can download it from the SANS website. And they structure their recommendations in a slightly different way, but I fully endorse them. I really agree with the contents of this white paper. It summarizes what I just said in a little bit different way. To build a healthy ICS cybersecurity program, there are 5 basic things you need to start with. The first one is building good, secure architecture for your OT environment. What we're talking about there is things like that DMZ segmentation, segmentation of critical assets, thinking about consequences and which systems are most crucial and keeping them as isolated as possible. All those things play into building a more secure, I like to say, crispy candy outside and gooey candy inside, because there's always going to be vulnerabilities inside your industrial network. So we want to make it as defensible as possible, especially from a perimeter perspective. Network monitoring and detection. We can't know there's an incident going on if we can't detect it. We certainly can't figure out what caused an incident if we have no forensic data. It is absolutely crucial that you think about network monitoring and threat detection in your industrial environments, because again, it's going to look different than that of your enterprise environments. Different tooling, more passive detection, different types of threats, lower level protocols, industrial protocols. The technologies and what you're looking for are very different in those environments. And you can't make assumptions that the stuff you've implemented for enterprise is going to pick everything you need to up in your lower level industrial environment. Having an incident response plan. Yes, yes, yes. I have so many people come to me during their worst day ever who have not planned at all for incident response. We get calls all the time from organizations who have a major incident of any of the types that I mentioned in their OT environment, and they want help right now because they've planned for nothing. And I'll let you in on a secret. And the unfortunate truth is most vendors out there that do cybersecurity incident response are backlogged. And there is usually a wait. Contracts take a while to negotiate, and we have to learn about your environment. We have to develop an asset inventory if you don't have one. So there's a lot of delays that come into not doing pre-planning for incident response, and they are expensive delays when we're talking about process consequences. So plan, and test those plans specifically for OT. Think about incidents that occur in your process environment and how they would impact you and how you would respond. Vulnerability management. Yes, low-level devices in industrial environments like PLCs, yes, they're vulnerable. They are vulnerable. They're very simple computers and they do what you tell them to do. But it's important to know which devices are vulnerable. So again, you can build those secure architecture stands around them, and you can build network monitoring and detection around them and try to control the access to them and how they could potentially be tampered with. We have those vulnerable devices. We need to know where they are and how they can potentially impact, cause a consequence of concern in the process, and try to build controls to protect them more soundly. And finally, remote access control. I talked a lot about VPN. We see that all the time. We're seeing VPN without multi-factor abused consistently to cause incidents. Reuse passwords, reuse credentials. Control your remote access, both yours and your vendors and the other people who have stakeholders who have access to your industrial environment. Be aware of all those different routes into your environment and put the best controls possible on them. Be aware of them, know where they're at, and try to make them more secure architecturally. That means multi-factor. That means monitoring of connections, logging of connection data as verbose as possible, retained somewhere that won't be wiped out by an adversary. Again, these seem like really simple things, but they can be a big challenge in OT. And they can also have a huge impact, positive impact, if you implement them before you have a cybersecurity incident or somebody tries to attack you. Those are my recommendations for you. That's about all I can do for you in 30 minutes. I hope that was helpful. I hope it gave you some ideas to start thinking about your OT environment and how to handle incident response and even security and security engineering in those environments. My contact information is here. I'd be happy to talk to you more about this. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for attending my talk.